Hey guys. Tonight, we're stepping into a world where walls were thick, windows were tiny, and every night could feel like the cold itself was trying to creep inside and claim you. Imagine a castle in the dead of winter. Outside, snow piles high against the ramparts. The wind screams through arrow slits, rattling shutters. Inside, the stone walls are icy, the floors are freezing, and the fire, well, the fire is just a tiny flicker fighting a losing battle against the chill. So, how did people survive nights like this? Not just kings and queens with feather beds and furs, but servants sleeping on straw pallets in drafty corridors. How did entire households endure weeks of darkness and frost, long before central heating or electric blankets existed? In these castles, warmth wasn't something you could take for granted. It was fought for, meticulously. Fires had to be tended all night. Beds had to be layered with blankets, tapestries, and even heated stones. People huddled together. Pets, stray animals, even tiny quirks like rolling your blankets just so, or preheating your sheets could mean the difference between a tolerable night and freezing misery. And here's the thing. These weren't just random hacks. They were a subtle, often bizarre choreography that shaped medieval life. The architecture, the routines, the very way people slept. Everything revolved around surviving the cold. Tonight, we're going to float through these castles, step by step, from noble chambers to servant corridors, from the flicker of a warming pan to the bitter chill seeping through stone walls. You'll see how humans, over centuries, turned drafty stone prisons into spaces where life endured. Against every icy night, so dim the lights, settle in, and let's drift into a world where winter never gave up, and survival depended on every little trick, every layer, and every human heartbeat.
The slow art of not freezing in a giant stone refrigerator. Hey guys, tonight we begin with a question that sounds simple, but is actually slightly tragic. How did people sleep in medieval castles without freezing to death? So go ahead and dim the lights. Maybe grab a blanket, preferably one that is not made of damp 14th century wool, and settle in. Because for the next few hours, we're going to wander through drafty corridors, smoky bedchambers, and deeply questionable architectural decisions. We'll glide through the lives of kings, queens, servants, and that one guy whose only job was basically to keep the fire alive at 3 a.m. No pressure, just the survival of the monarchy. Now, when we picture a medieval castle, we tend to imagine something majestic. Tall towers, flowing banners, a regal figure gazing out over the countryside. What we don't imagine is the cold. And I mean bone-deep, soul-questioning cold. Because castles were, in many ways, enormous stone refrigerators. Beautiful, imposing, designed to intimidate invaders, but thermally efficient? Absolutely not. Stone is great at one thing, holding on to whatever temperature it already has. In summer, that could be nice. A cool stone hall on a hot day? Lovely. In winter, that same stone politely absorbs every ounce of warmth your poor little fireplace produces and then radiates chill right back into your spine. So let's float back to, say, 13th century England, maybe somewhere like Dover Castle or Warwick Castle. Massive curtain walls, narrow windows, high ceilings. Very dramatic, very cold. Most castles were built primarily for defense, thick walls to stop arrows and siege engines, tiny windows to prevent invaders from climbing in, high ceilings because showing off is timeless. None of this screams cozy winter retreat. So how did people sleep? First, we need to separate fantasy from reality. Not everyone in a castle lived the same way. The lord and lady of the castle? They had options. The servants? Less so. Let's start with the lord's chamber. The main bedchamber in a castle wasn't just a bedroom. It was practically a stage set. Important business happened there. Guests were received there. Sometimes political decisions were made there. Privacy was, Negotiable. But warmth? That was very negotiable. One of the key tools in the anti-freezing arsenal was the fireplace. By the high Middle Ages, castles began including proper fireplaces built into walls with chimneys. Before that, many halls had central hearths where smoke just sort of wandered upward and hoped for the best. Imagine trying to sleep while your eyes water from smoke and the temperature still feels like early January in a stone cave, because that was reality for centuries. Even once wall fireplaces became common, they weren't magical. A fireplace warms the area close to it. The farther away you are, the more you question your life choices. And since medieval beds were often placed away from direct drafts, but not necessarily next to the fire, you still had a cold room with one optimistic glowing corner. This is where the canopy bed enters the chat. Ah yes, the four-poster bed. It wasn't invented purely for drama and royal portrait vibes. The canopy, along with thick curtains, created a microclimate. Think of it as a tiny heated box within a freezing stone cube. Heavy curtains made of wool, velvet, or even fur were drawn around the bed. These trapped body heat inside. It wasn't central heating, it was human heating. You got into bed, you closed the curtains, you basically marinated in your own warmth. Romantic? Slightly. Practical? Very. And then there were the bed hangings. Thick textiles lined the walls. Tapestries weren't just decorative storytelling devices showing heroic hunts and mythical creatures. They were insulation. When you hang several layers of heavy fabric against a stone wall, you create a barrier. It's not perfect, but it reduces the icy breath of winter seeping directly through the masonry. So, if you ever see a castle room filled with tapestries, just know that beneath the medieval artwork was a simple message: please, dear God, block the wind. Now let's talk about bedding. Mattresses were not the springy orthopedic miracles we enjoy today. They were typically sacks filled with straw, feathers, wool, or whatever stuffing the household could afford. Feather beds were luxurious. Straw mattresses were crunchy. But here's the key: layers. Medieval sleepers used multiple blankets. Wool blankets were common because wool retains warmth even when slightly damp, which was helpful because dampness was basically unavoidable in a stone building during winter. The wealthy might also use fur covers. Imagine snuggling under layers of wool, fur, and heavy linen. You'd look like a bundled pastry, but you'd be warm, eventually. And then, before anyone climbed into this cocoon, something rather clever might happen. Enter the warming pan. This delightful little invention was essentially a long-handled metal pan filled with hot coals. A servant would slide it between the sheets before bedtime to warm them up. It was like medieval preheating. Of course, one had to be careful not to set the bed on fire, because that would rather defeat the purpose. Some households also used heated stones or bricks wrapped in cloth. These were placed at the foot of the bed. Ancient hot water bottle energy. Now, imagine you're a king. Let's say someone like Edward I of England, a powerful ruler, builder of castles, hammer of the Scots. And yet, when night fell in winter, even he relied on thick curtains and warmed sheets like everyone else. Power does not defeat thermodynamics. But here's where things get interesting. Sleeping arrangements were rarely solitary. In noble households, it was common for attendants to sleep in the same chamber, sometimes even in the same bed. Not romantic, just practical. Body heat matters. In fact, communal sleeping was common across social classes. Sharing beds conserved warmth. It also saved space. Privacy, again, was not a high priority in medieval architecture. Survival was. Now, let's gently shift down the social ladder. Servants, guards, kitchen workers, stable hands. Where did they sleep when the temperature dropped below freezing? Not in luxurious four-poster cocoons, that's for sure. Many servants slept in communal halls, on pallets, on straw mattresses laid directly on the floor, sometimes near the kitchen hearth if they were lucky. The Great Hall, the central communal room of a castle, often had a large hearth. After the lord and lady retired, lower-ranking members of the household might bed down near the dying embers. It was warmer there, smoky, but warmer. Others slept in lofts, corridors, or small side chambers built into the thickness of castle walls. These spaces were cramped, insulated only by more stone. If you were a guard, you might sleep in the gatehouse or a tower chamber, high up, wind exposed, perfect for defense, less perfect for comfort. And yet they survived, partly because people in the medieval period were simply more accustomed to cold interiors. Their expectations were different. A room at 10 degrees Celsius might have felt unpleasant, but normal. Clothing helped. People did not change into light cotton pajamas. They often slept in linen shifts or even in some of their day clothes. Nightcaps were common. Cover your head, conserve heat. In fact, much body heat escapes through the head. Medieval people didn't know the science. They just knew that wearing a cap at night made them less miserable. Smart. And then there's architecture itself. Over time, castle design slowly adapted. By the later Middle Ages, more private chambers were built. Fireplaces became more common. Windows sometimes had shutters and even glass panes in wealthier residences. Glass was expensive, but it helped slightly. Shutters were crucial. Thick wooden shutters closed tightly at night to block wind. Without them, narrow arrow slits turned into icy wind tunnels. Let's also remember that castles were not always the primary winter residence for royalty. Many monarchs preferred more comfortable palaces when possible. Even places like Windsor Castle evolved over time to become more livable, with improved heating and more refined interiors. Because after a few centuries of shivering, even royalty thought, maybe we should upgrade. Still, for much of the medieval period, sleeping in a castle during winter required strategy, layers, fire management, architectural improvisation, and a high tolerance of mild discomfort. And that's just the beginning, because we haven't even talked about what happened when water froze inside stone walls, or how people bathed, or even if they wanted to. But don't worry, we have hours to go.
So let's gently shift from the Lord's bedchamber to the great smoky hall and explore what an average winter night actually sounded like inside those towering stone walls.
The Great Hall at midnight and the symphony of drafts. So let's stay right there. It's the middle of winter, somewhere in 14th century England. The wind is doing that long, low moan around the battlements. Not dramatic, just persistent, like it has nowhere better to be. You're inside the great hall of a castle, maybe somewhere like Alnwick Castle or Conwy Castle. By day, this hall is busy, loud, full of clanking trenchers and political awkwardness. But now it's late. The Lord has retired. The torches are out. The fire in the central hearth has burned low. And the hall exhales. The first thing you'd notice is the sound. Stone buildings do not sleep quietly. Timber beams creak. Ash shifts in the hearth. Wind presses against shutters that may or may not fit properly. Somewhere high in the rafters, a draft snakes its way through a crack and drops cold air down like a polite but relentless ghost. If you were a servant, this is where you might be bedding down. Not in a grand chamber, not in velvet-lined cocoon, but on a pallet near the wall. A pallet, by the way, is not a luxurious mattress. It's essentially a sack of straw, sometimes fresh, sometimes less fresh. You spread it out, you wrap yourself in a wool blanket, possibly two if you're lucky, and you position yourself strategically.
Not too close to the hearth, because stray sparks are not a fun way to wake up. But not too far either, because frostbite is worse. The Great Hall was often the warmest communal space simply because it had the largest fire. During feasts, the heat from bodies and food preparation would temporarily make it almost comfortable. But at night, when the fire was reduced to embers to conserve fuel, the temperature dropped quickly. And fuel mattered. Firewood was not infinite, even for a wealthy household. Gathering, transporting, and storing enough wood for winter was a major logistical operation. Forest rights were regulated. Wood had to be managed carefully. You couldn't just keep a roaring blaze going all night in every room, so fires were often allowed to die down after the household went to bed, which means that from midnight until dawn, it got steadily colder. Now, let's drift up one of the narrow spiral staircases, the kind designed to favor right-handed defenders with swords, because of course, even the staircase had a defensive personality. We arrive at a private chamber, smaller than the hall, slightly easier to warm. Slightly. By the later Middle Ages, castles increasingly featured separate heated rooms called solar chambers. The solar was typically a more private upper room where the lord and family could withdraw. It often had its own fireplace, which was a luxury. But even here, heat distribution was optimistic. Hot air rises, which sounds helpful, but in a tall stone room with a high ceiling, it simply meant that all the warmth floated upward and gathered near the rafters. Meanwhile, the people remained down below, cold. To combat this, beds were sometimes placed on raised wooden platforms, not just for status, but to get slightly closer to the warmer air. Again, medieval solutions were practical. If heat rises, then so shall we. Let's imagine a noblewoman settling into bed, maybe someone like Eleanor of Aquitaine during her years in England, a powerful, intelligent figure used to the relative mildness of southern France. Northern winters may not have impressed her. Her chamber would likely be draped in textiles, tapestries along the walls, heavy bed curtains drawn tightly. A servant has already used a warming pan to heat the sheets. She might wear a linen shift and a nightcap, perhaps even wool stockings, because no one enjoys icy toes, not even a queen. And while she sleeps, an attendant might remain nearby, not just for service, but because human presence equaled warmth and security. Let's pause for a moment on that idea of shared space. Medieval people rarely slept alone, even among the elite. Beds were valuable pieces of furniture. They were inherited, gifted, mentioned in wills. A large bed might accommodate spouses, young children, and occasionally attendants. This was not scandalous, it was normal. Warmth was communal. Privacy was a modern obsession. And speaking of warmth, let's talk about clothing at night in a bit more detail. People didn't necessarily undress completely before bed. That would mean facing the cold air twice, once to undress and once to dress again in the morning. Layering was life. Undergarments were typically made of linen. Over that, some might keep light wool garments. Nightcaps were nearly universal in colder climates. You might even wrap a scarf around your neck. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. Now let's drift downward again, this time into the lower levels, storage rooms, kitchens, possibly even the undercroft. These spaces were colder still. Thick stone vaults, minimal light, damp air that lingered year-round. Kitchen staff often rose before dawn to rekindle the fires. Imagine being the poor soul whose job was to stumble out of a straw pallet in near darkness and coax life back into cold ashes. No electric ignition, no thermostat, just flint, steel, and determination. And if the fire didn't catch, well, breakfast would be delayed, and nobody wants an irritated lord before sunrise. The kitchen hearth was massive. When active, it generated substantial heat, so kitchen staff might choose to sleep nearby if space allowed. But kitchens were also smoky and soot-covered. Comfort was relative. Now, let's gently widen the lens because not all castles were in England. Over in France, in places like Château de Chinon, similar strategies were used. Thick walls, fireplaces, heavy textiles. In colder regions of Europe, insulation sometimes included additional wooden paneling inside chambers. Wood helped reduce the direct chill of stone. In parts of Germany and Central Europe, tiled stoves, called Kachelofen, became increasingly popular in later centuries. These large masonry stoves retained heat far longer than open fireplaces, which honestly was a brilliant upgrade. But early medieval castles largely relied on open hearths and fireplaces, and those required constant attention. Let's not forget another subtle factor: body adaptation. Medieval people were more accustomed to fluctuating indoor temperatures. They grew up in drafty environments. Their expectations were different. A perfectly climate-controlled bedroom would have seemed alien. Cold was part of life, still unpleasant, but normal. And then there's bedding maintenance. Straw mattresses needed replacing. Damp bedding had to be aired out. Mold was a risk. So on dry days, even in winter, servants might haul bedding outside to air in the pale sunlight. Imagine the sight: rows of blankets draped over castle walls, like medieval laundry day meets fortress chic. Now, let's talk about one more detail: animals. Not inside the Lord's bed, obviously, but proximity mattered. In some smaller fortified manor houses, livestock might be kept in adjacent structures or even partially integrated into the building complex. Their body heat contributed slightly to the overall warmth. And so, night settles fully. The fires are low, the shutters are closed, the wind continues its quiet campaign against the battlements. Inside their layered cocoons, the inhabitants of the castle sleep. Not perfectly warm, not perfectly comfortable, but insulated by wool, fur, fabric, and each other. No central heating, no radiators ticking gently, no heated blankets humming with electricity. Just stone, fire, fabric, and a collective agreement to endure winter together. And as we continue, we'll drift into something even more delicate. What happened when the cold wasn't just uncomfortable, but dangerous? Because sometimes winter didn't simply chill the castle, it tested it.
When winter stopped being cute and started testing the walls. So we've talked about the cozy illusions, the canopy beds, the warming pans, the heavy wool blankets doing their very best. But now let's gently drift into the part of winter that was less charming. Because medieval winters were not curated aesthetic experiences. There were no soft, focused snowflakes drifting past Instagram-friendly battlements. There were hard freezes, long freezes, the kind that made stone crack and water turn stubborn. And castles, for all their dramatic silhouettes, were not immune. Let's imagine it's January in the 14th century, somewhere north, maybe an Edinburgh castle, perched high on volcanic rock, heroically exposed to every available wind. The temperature has dropped well below freezing for days. The outer walls are rimed with frost. The courtyard well has a thin crust of ice each morning. Inside, even the thick stone walls begin to surrender to the cold. And here's the thing about stone. Once it's cold all the way through, warming it back up takes time, a lot of time. A single fireplace can't compete with meters-thick masonry that has decided to become one with winter. So what happens? First, water becomes an issue. Pipes as we know them didn't exist. Water was carried from wells, cisterns, or nearby springs, stored in barrels, kept in jugs. If the storage area wasn't heated, the water could freeze solid, which is inconvenient when you need to cook, clean, or not dehydrate.
In extreme cold, servants might store water closer to the hearth or inside warmer chambers to prevent freezing, because nothing says efficient household management like rotating your water supply based on temperature survival strategies. And then there were the walls themselves. Stone absorbs moisture. When that moisture freezes, it expands. Over repeated cycles, it can crack mortar and damage surfaces. Medieval builders understood this in practice, even if they didn't phrase it in modern physics terms. Maintenance was constant. Mortar needed repair. Drafty gaps had to be sealed. In winter, cloth, straw, or even moss might be stuffed into cracks around shutters to block wind. Picture a servant methodically wedging bits of fabric into a window seam at dusk. Not glamorous, but deeply necessary. Now let's talk about windows. Earlier castles had narrow arrow slits. Later medieval residences developed slightly larger windows, sometimes fitted with glass. Glass was expensive, delicate, and not particularly insulating by modern standards. So even in castles like Windsor Castle, which gradually evolved into something closer to a palace, windows were still thermal liabilities. Shutters were essential. Thick wooden panels closed tightly at night. Sometimes additional fabric hangings were drawn across them, because every tiny gap invited the wind inside. And wind in a stone corridor is not playful, it is determined. Now let's glide toward the emotional side of winter, because sleeping in cold conditions isn't just about blankets, it's about morale. Imagine being a young noble sent to serve in a distant castle household. The days are short, the light is gray, the hall smells faintly of smoke and damp wool. The novelty fades quickly. Letters from home take weeks or months. Fires burn low at night. You share a chamber with attendants you barely know. Winter could feel isolating, even for royalty. Take someone like Henry VI of England, a deeply introspective and frankly fragile king. He was known for periods of mental withdrawal. Now imagine enduring a long medieval winter in a drafty residence while also carrying the psychological weight of a kingdom sliding toward civil war. Cold amplifies everything. Silence feels heavier. Shadows stretch longer. And unlike today, there were no distractions powered by electricity, no glowing screens, just candlelight, and eventually darkness. So people adapted their schedules. Winter meant longer nights, more sleep in theory, but also more time indoors. Textile work increased, reading for those who could, quiet conversation, storytelling, and yes, more fire tending. Let's not forget the fire wardens of the night. In larger households, someone had responsibility for maintaining embers safely. Fires could not simply be left to roar unattended. The risk of accidental blaze in a timber-roofed hall was very real. So there was always a balance, enough heat to prevent misery, not so much as to burn down the ancestral home. Because rebuilding a castle after a fire was inconvenient. Now let's drift lower again, to the servants who had fewer buffers against the cold. If you slept on the floor of a corridor or in an attic-like loft space, you felt every temperature shift. Roofs were insulated with timber and sometimes thatch in auxiliary buildings, but in main stone keeps, upper levels could be frigid. Frost could form inside unheated areas. Not thick snowdrifts indoors, but delicate crystalline edges along metal objects. Waking up meant bracing yourself, pulling back a blanket into cold air, dressing quickly, perhaps rubbing your hands together before daring to step on the floor. There's a reason layered clothing remained standard. Now let's float sideways to continental Europe again, somewhere like Hohensalzburg Fortress, high altitude, alpine winds. Here, defensive architecture met mountain climate. Heating innovations developed slowly over time. Tiled stoves became more common in Central Europe because they retained heat longer than open fireplaces. These stoves could warm a room more evenly, which must have felt revolutionary.
But in earlier centuries, open hearths dominated, and open hearths are dramatic but inefficient. Now here's a detail that rarely gets mentioned. Bed placement mattered enormously. Beds were often positioned away from exterior walls when possible, because exterior walls were the coldest surfaces in the room. Interior partition walls, separating one chamber from another, were slightly warmer. So the layout of a room wasn't purely aesthetic, it was strategic. And if the castle was large enough, entire wings might be closed off during winter to conserve fuel and labor. Why heat rooms no one is using? So parts of the castle would effectively hibernate, doors shut, fires unlit, furniture covered. Winter quarters were compacted into the most manageable sections. Efficient, sensible, slightly claustrophobic. Now let's imagine the coldest nights, the ones where breath fogs in the air, even indoors. You are wrapped in wool, curtains drawn tight around your bed. Perhaps there's a heated stone at your feet. You listen to the faint crackle of embers from the hearth across the chamber. And despite all the effort, your nose is cold. That might sound trivial, but small discomforts accumulate. Still, people survived, generation after generation, partly through material solutions, partly through adaptation, and partly because winter, no matter how long, eventually loosened its grip. Spring came, fires burned lower, windows opened, damp bedding aired out fully. But for now, in this long medieval night, survival meant cooperation, firewood, fabric, architecture, and patience. And as we continue, we'll explore something even subtler. Not just how they survived the cold physically, but how castles themselves slowly evolved, almost reluctantly, to become slightly less hostile to the humans sleeping inside them.
Gradual comfort. How castles learned to stop being iceboxes. All right, so we've wandered through frost-bitten halls, smoky embers, and bedchambers wrapped in fabric like human burritos. Now let's drift into the slow evolution of comfort. Castles didn't wake up one morning and decide, hey, let's install central heating. No, comfort arrived reluctantly in fits and starts. Early medieval castles were strictly about defense. Thick walls, narrow windows, and high ceilings were excellent for keeping enemies out. They were terrible for keeping warmth in. But as the Middle Ages progressed, the human inhabitants began to make subtle demands. Let's float to France for a moment, perhaps somewhere like Château de Vincennes. French nobles gradually developed private chambers, small, more intimate spaces with fireplaces. These rooms were often placed on interior walls, not exposed directly to the freezing wind. Privacy and warmth became linked. A smaller room was easier to heat, and with a fireplace close by, the room could achieve a tolerable temperature. Wealthy households started to recognize that insulation was more than tapestries. Wood paneling, layered curtains, and even cork in some cases helped. Some of these techniques sound quaint today, but in a stone castle, they were revolutionary. Now let's drift toward the bed. Earlier, we discussed the four-poster canopy bed, but in the later medieval period, beds became increasingly sophisticated. Multiple mattresses stacked atop each other, feather beds added where available, furs used for extra insulation. Bed curtains weren't just around the bed anymore. They sometimes wrapped the bed entirely, creating a tiny tent within a room. Which, if you think about it, is both charming and slightly depressing, because you could have all that grandeur, yet you still needed to trap your own body heat. Heating tools evolved too. The warming pan, which we mentioned before, became common enough that households often had multiple on hand. These long-handled pans filled with hot coals could be slid between sheets just before bedtime, providing a brief moment of warmth that felt like luxury. Some households even experimented with metal or ceramic bed bricks. Heated by the fire, they retained warmth for hours. Now let's pause and think about the social element. People slept in shared chambers, sometimes with attendants or children. It wasn't just tradition, it was efficiency. Body heat is communal, and when firewood was limited, human warmth was the best resource available. In some northern castles, where winters were particularly harsh, entire families might share a single heated chamber. Privacy was secondary to survival. The architecture gradually adapted as well. Towers and keeps, once purely defensive, slowly incorporated windows with shutters, chimneys, and even early glass panes. Some castles built solars, upper chambers with south-facing exposure to catch what little sunlight could penetrate winter clouds. Walls were lined with tapestries and hangings more systematically. They weren't just decorative, they were thermal strategy. Even doors became slightly more sophisticated. Layered wooden doors, sometimes combined with curtains, reduced drafts. And let's not forget the floors. Stone floors were brutal, so households often layered rushes, straw, or even early rugs across walkways and chambers. Walking barefoot on a winter morning without this preparation, a nightmare. Now let's float over to Central Europe. Places like Hohenzollern Castle or Hohensalzburg Fortress began experimenting with masonry stoves called Kachelofen. These tiled stoves were a revelation. Unlike open fireplaces, which wasted most of their heat up chimneys, Kachelofen radiated warmth slowly and evenly across a room for hours. And for the wealthiest, multiple stoves in multiple chambers meant you could move from one warm space to another, a kind of primitive zoning. But for the majority of castle dwellers, warmth still relied heavily on preparation, layered bedding, clothing, and strategic use of fireplaces. And here's an interesting detail. Medieval people developed routines around sleep to manage cold. Bedtime was often later than we might expect, not just because of lighting, but because you wanted the fire to die down slowly. You might spend time socializing, sewing, or tending to small tasks until the hearth retained a gentle glow rather than raw flame. Some nobles even maintained night attendants, whose role was to stoke embers without letting the fire flare dangerously. And yet, the cold was never entirely vanquished. Even with these adaptations, winter nights could be brutal. This is where we gently drift toward the psychological aspect of cold. People were accustomed to discomfort. Their expectations were lower. A room at 10 or 12 degrees Celsius might have felt unpleasant but normal. Modern humans would panic. Medieval humans wrapped a blanket tighter, added another layer, and adjusted the fire. Sleep itself was adapted. People often slept in segments, sometimes called first sleep and second sleep. The night was broken into 2 periods, with wakeful hours in between. Those hours could be used for reflection, prayer, or small household chores. And if you were particularly inventive or desperate, you might even use those hours to manage heat. Reposition bedding, reheat a stone, slide a warming pan into the sheets again. This brings us to another subtle strategy: architectural foresight. Castle designers began considering heat flow. Beds were placed on interior walls, away from cold drafts. Fireplaces were positioned to radiate into the rooms most used at night. Even corridor design mattered. Narrow passageways could help channel warmth to the inner chambers. And in some cases, secondary heating rooms, like small kitchens or guard chambers, were intentionally used as buffers against the cold. So, by the later Middle Ages, sleeping in a castle was still chilly, but it was survivable. Comfort had crept forward incrementally. Better fireplaces, bed curtains, tapestries, layered bedding, communal warmth, careful placement of rooms, and the occasional Kachelofen. Still, winter was humbling. It reminded everyone, from the king in his grand chamber to the servant on the floor, that stone buildings are loyal to defense, not comfort. And so, for centuries, humans adapted slowly and deliberately, developing a strange, elegant choreography of survival. Next, we'll float even closer to the human side of this story, how nobles, servants, and attendants managed the interplay of sleep, social hierarchy, and survival in the coldest months. Because surviving a winter night wasn't just a matter of blankets, it was strategy. It was choreography. It was, in a word, life.
All right, so now we've reached the part of our slow, drafty journey where we focus on people. Not stone, not tapestries, not fireplaces. People. Because surviving a medieval winter night wasn't just about having things like blankets or firewood. It was about knowing your place, your priorities, and sometimes your neighbor's body heat. Let's drift back to a typical castle in Northern Europe, somewhere like Bodiam Castle. The lord and lady occupy the best rooms, of course. Fireplace nearby, thick curtains drawn around their bed, possibly even furs layered on top of bedding. Temperature control in their context is semi-effective, not perfect, but better than anyone else. Next tier down, attendants, close family members, or favored guests. These people might sleep in the same chamber as the lord and lady or in adjacent rooms. They benefit indirectly from proximity to the fire and from the warmth of their more privileged neighbors. And then we come to the servants, guards, and stable staff. They often sleep on straw pallets in the great hall or in corridors near the hearth. A single glowing hearth can't warm an entire hall efficiently, so placement is everything. The ones closest to the fire get the comfort, those further away brace themselves. Body heat became a form of currency. Sleeping close to someone or even huddling with siblings or colleagues was literally about survival. This led to interesting social practices. For example, households often designated specific sleeping rotations. If the hearth was small and your pallet was far from it, sometimes you shared space with someone warmer for part of the night, then rotated closer to the embers. Efficiency and survival, not luxury, dictated these arrangements. Let's also float into nighttime routines. Medieval people didn't just lie down and pass out. Preparation was a ritual. First, you ensured your bedding was arranged, straw mattresses fluffed, blankets layered. If you were lucky, a warming pan or hot stone was slid between sheets. Clothing was layered, a linen shift, perhaps wool garments over it, nightcap on the head, and stockings if you had them. You might even wrap your hands or shoulders in extra cloth if the room felt especially bitter. For nobility, attendants were responsible for maintaining warmth. Fires were monitored until the household retired fully for the night. Some castles even employed night attendants specifically to stoke embers, watch for sparks, or tend to heating implements like warming pans. Now here's an interesting contrast: communal sleeping arrangements. Even in high-status chambers, privacy was relative. Beds were shared with family members or attendants. The practice of shared sleep served multiple purposes: warmth, security, and occasionally convenience in crowded quarters. It wasn't considered scandalous, it was practical. Moving down again to the servants' quarters. In the great hall, lofts above the kitchen, or corridors along outer walls, the cold was more persistent. The air was denser with smoke from the hearth, but heat was limited. Servants slept on straw pallets, huddled together. Blankets might be thin or shared. Noise was constant. The floor creaked, someone stoked the fire intermittently, winds whistled through gaps in doors and windows. Yet people adapted. Humans are remarkably resilient. Children often slept alongside adults. Their smaller bodies meant more collective warmth. Animals occasionally contributed heat indirectly. Horses, pigs, or dogs were nearby, sometimes in stables connected to the main building to provide subtle insulation benefits. Let's float westward to castles in the colder reaches of Scotland or Scandinavia. Here, winters could be brutal, temperatures well below freezing, snow drifting against walls, winds cutting like knives through exposed battlements. Architecture helped only partially. Walls were thick, fireplaces existed, but heat retention was still a challenge. People layered even more. Extra bedding, multiple blankets, fur wraps, thick nightcaps. There are accounts of nobles in Scandinavia who kept heated stones in their beds throughout winter. Even the tiniest bit of radiated warmth could make a significant difference. And let's not forget about sleeping positions. Historical texts and accounts hint that people slept strategically, curled up to preserve heat, with extremities tucked close to the body, feet near a heated stone, heads under nightcaps, arms close to the chest. It's subtle but survival-minded. Another point, preparation of rooms. Even in late medieval castles, stone floors and walls remained chill. To mitigate this, rushes, straw, or early rugs were laid on floors. Furniture and beds were positioned away from exterior walls, towards the interior of the room. Doors and shutters were layered with curtains or textiles. Every small barrier helped. So heat was layered in 3 dimensions: horizontally, with textiles and placement; vertically, with raised beds and bedding stacks; and relationally, by sharing space with other humans. Now let's drift back to the psychological element. Being cold was unpleasant, very unpleasant. But people adjusted expectations. Stone rooms at 10 or 12 degrees Celsius were normal. Cold was a relative measure. People learned to endure. The wealthy added layers of comfort. The less privileged leaned on communal body heat, small adjustments, and sheer habituation. And there was routine. Nighttime wakefulness was expected. People often woke in the middle of the night, tended the fire, rearranged bedding, or performed small household chores. Sleep was segmented. First sleep, a period of wakefulness, then second sleep. This segmented sleep allowed people to manage discomfort. It also gave them a chance to prepare for the coldest hours. By the later medieval period, some castles even employed what we might think of as primitive heating strategy manuals. Households maintained protocols for distributing firewood, rotating night attendants, and warming beds. These were documented in household records, practical guidance, not luxury advice. And so, over centuries, sleeping in a castle became increasingly tolerable. Not warm by modern standards, not comfortable in a cushioned sense, but survivable. All these human adaptations, the clothing, bedding, bed placement, room arrangement, rotation of body heat, and fire management, created a delicate equilibrium. It was a choreography that balanced architecture, technology, and social hierarchy. The castle itself remained imposing, drafty, and stone cold at times, but human ingenuity softened the blow. Next, we'll drift into even subtler adaptations, seasonal preparations, clothing innovations, and small comforts that made the cold months less hostile, often invisible to modern eyes, yet crucial to survival. All right, let's slowly drift into the seasonal side of castle life. Not the grand feasts or political intrigues, but the quiet, methodical preparation that made surviving winter nights at least possible. Because castles didn't just hope for warmth to appear magically. Medieval households planned for winter long before frost touched the walls. Let's imagine it's late autumn, perhaps October in northern France, at a castle like Château de Pierrefonds. The leaves are falling, the wind has begun its whispering complaints around the battlements. Inside, preparations begin quietly. First, textiles. Every tapestry, blanket, and rug is checked, repaired, and relocated if necessary. Heavy curtains are hung in living and sleeping quarters. Not just around beds, around windows and doorways too. Every flap of wool or velvet adds a layer of insulation against winter drafts. Next, firewood. Even the wealthiest households needed months of wood. Wood was chopped, dried, and stored strategically. Dry wood burns efficiently. Wet wood smokes and fails to generate adequate heat. Some castles had vaulted storerooms to keep fuel dry, while in others it was piled as close to the hearth as possible without creating a fire hazard. Now let's consider bedding. Straw mattresses were aired, feathers were fluffed and layered on top of beds, fur was added for extra insulation. Some wealthier nobles even had multiple bedding sets, swapping out lighter linens for heavier coverings when the first frost arrived. And then there was clothing. Linen shifts were standard for sleeping, often under wool or fur layers. Nightcaps were common. Woolen stockings and gloves sometimes made appearances in extreme cold. Remember, medieval people didn't expect rooms to be warm. They expected clothing and bedding to compensate. Now, let's drift into the human rhythms that developed alongside these preparations. As nights grew longer, daily routines shifted. Evening chores were performed efficiently. Kitchens produced meals that could be eaten near the fire, maximizing warmth. Attendants stoked fires late into the evening, ensuring embers remained until household members retreated to bed. Some households maintained night attendants whose entire role was to manage hearths, watch embers, and occasionally move heated stones or pans into bedrooms. Even the nobility adopted subtle habits. They arranged beds strategically, away from cold exterior walls and closer to fireplaces or interior walls. Curtains were drawn tightly, extra blankets or furs were added. And human presence mattered. Family members, attendants, and occasionally guests shared chambers to preserve warmth. Huddling wasn't about intimacy, it was about survival. Now let's float over to another detail often overlooked: small objects of comfort. Heated stones, warmed bricks, and coals in metal pans were all used. These weren't just conveniences, they were survival tools. Placed at the foot of the bed or tucked into blankets, they provided several hours of gentle warmth. Warming pans in particular were ingenious. A long-handled metal pan filled with coals allowed servants to preheat beds without burning anyone. And in wealthier households, multiple pans could be used sequentially throughout the night, keeping sheets pleasantly warm. Let's drift upward again to the psychological benefits. Winter in a castle was not just a physical challenge, it was a mental one. Long nights, dim lighting, cold stone walls. Humans coped through routine, rhythm, and shared experience. Nighttime wakefulness allowed tending fires, adjusting bedding, or quietly preparing for the coldest hours. It also created a rhythm to life: first sleep, wakefulness, second sleep. In some accounts, first sleep occurred shortly after dusk, lasting 2 to 3 hours. Then a period of wakefulness, used for quiet reflection, household chores, or tending to fires. Finally, second sleep carried occupants until dawn. This segmented sleep pattern was, in effect, a human adaptation to the environmental conditions. Now, let's gently consider the role of architecture again. By the late medieval period, castle design increasingly reflected comfort considerations. Windows sometimes had interior shutters or glass panes. Walls were lined with textiles or wood paneling. Fireplaces were positioned strategically to radiate warmth efficiently. Floors were layered with rushes, straw, or early rugs. Beds were raised from the stone floor. Every small detail contributed to a slightly more tolerable winter night. And even corridors played a role. Narrow passageways helped contain warmth. Secondary rooms acted as buffers. And yet, the cold was never fully defeated. It remained a persistent companion, shaping behaviors, routines, and hierarchies. But human ingenuity,
Layering, textiles, shared warmth, fire management, and strategic placement of beds created a fragile, manageable balance. And so, as winter deepened, the castle slowly became not a freezing stone prison, but a space where life continued, night after night, in quiet adaptation. In the next part, we'll drift into some of the stranger, more subtle human strategies for staying warm, the quirky habits, personal routines, and inventive little solutions that made the cold a little less relentless.
All right, let's float gently now into the more personal side of surviving medieval winters. We've talked about architecture, textiles, and the big strategies. Now let's look at the small, often charming ways humans coped with the chill. First, personal layering rituals. Medieval people didn't just throw on a blanket and hope for the best. They developed a sort of choreography around bedtime. You'd put on your linen shift, then perhaps a wool tunic, wrap a scarf or extra cloth around your shoulders, pull on stockings, cap on your head, gloves if the night was exceptionally frigid. For the wealthy, furs could be draped over the shoulders or tucked beneath bedding. Every layer trapped air, the ancient equivalent of a modern thermal blanket. And then there were heated objects. We've mentioned warming pans, but some households went further. Heated stones or bricks were placed in metal boxes or wrapped in cloth. They could sit at the foot of the bed, or even under pillows in some cases. Yes, under the pillow, a gentle radiated warmth for your head, a little luxury. Even small, seemingly mundane practices mattered. Rolling blankets tightly to create dense, insulating rolls, positioning beds to catch subtle currents of warm air from the hearth, sharing body heat strategically. And let's not forget about footwear. Cold feet are mortal enemies of sleep. Medieval sleepers often wore socks or light shoes made of wool or soft leather at night. Some even tucked small bundles of straw or cloth inside for extra insulation. Now, let's float over to the more unusual habits. Some nobles apparently kept small animals in chambers, not for companionship, but for warmth. Dogs, cats, even small birds sometimes slept nearby. Their body heat contributed subtly to the human microclimate. Yes, you may now picture a tiny medieval snuggle party. People, cats, dogs, all vying for a bit of shared warmth. Practical, not sentimental. Another curious strategy, pre-sleep movement. People sometimes performed mild exercises, walking the room, tending the hearth, or even stretching. This generated body heat just before bedtime. It wasn't rigorous, no medieval aerobics classes, just gentle, necessary movement to ward off the initial chill when getting into bed. And then there were the social rituals. Nobles might gather in the solar chamber near a fireplace to talk quietly before bed. Attendants might tend embers or adjust bedding in these quiet hours. Conversation itself had warmth, literally in the sense of proximity and psychologically, as shared human presence helped tolerate the cold. Sleeping positions mattered too. People often curled up, keeping extremities close to their core, feet near heated stones or pans, heads under nightcaps or near thick blankets, arms tucked in. Even the way you placed blankets could make a difference, layering from feet upward, doubling blankets in areas where drafts were strongest. Strategic layering, tiny adjustments that could mean the difference between a tolerable night and a miserable one. Now, let's drift toward hygiene, which had an unexpected impact on warmth. Medieval people didn't bathe frequently, yes, but they did wash hands and faces. Clean skin allowed for better blood flow and warmth retention. Additionally, clean bedding, aired when possible, kept pests and dampness in check. Straw mattresses might be flipped or aired outside during sunny winter days, even briefly.
These small actions prevented dampness, which amplified cold. Let's not forget about the mental strategies. Enduring cold was partly habit. People accepted discomfort as part of life. Rooms at 10 degrees Celsius were normal. You adapted, you tolerated, you developed patience. Religious and meditative practices also played a role. Quiet reflection, prayer, or storytelling helped focus the mind away from discomfort. And sometimes distraction was warmth in itself. Focusing on shared stories or household routines created a sense of psychological comfort, easing the perception of cold. Even in noble households, winter nights could be monotonous. The cold was persistent, almost tactile. But human ingenuity, layering, shared body heat, small heated objects, movement, and mental strategies created a fragile balance that allowed life to continue. Now let's gently drift into another layer, hierarchy and warmth. Not everyone had equal access. Nobles had beds with multiple blankets, furs, and heating implements. Their attendants benefited indirectly. Servants and guards relied on shared sleeping arrangements, strategic placement near fires, and rotation systems. Those higher in status were warmer. Those lower, well, they endured more chill, but ingenuity often allowed them to survive without luxury. And interestingly, these hierarchies of warmth mirrored social hierarchies. Comfort was not just physical, it was social. Now, imagine a winter night stretching on. The fire embers glowed dimly, curtains drawn, layers upon layers of bedding, warmed stones at the feet, nightcaps snug on heads. Somewhere, a servant stirs to tend the hearth, adding coals with minimal fuss. Another shifts blankets to reduce drafts. A noble gently rearranges furs, adjusting the microclimate around their body. Outside, the wind moans through arrow slits and battlements. Inside, life continues quietly, patiently, layered with ingenuity and adaptation. And as we move forward, we'll explore how extreme winters affected castle life, how prolonged cold challenged even the wealthiest households, and the inventive solutions, sometimes odd, sometimes ingenious, that people developed to endure the longest, coldest nights.
Enduring extreme winters and the limits of comfort. All right, let's drift gently now into the harsher side of medieval winters. Not just your average chilly night, but prolonged cold that tested even the best prepared castles and households. Castles, for all their thick walls and fireplaces, were never immune to particularly brutal winters. Imagine January or February in Northern Europe, somewhere like Stirling Castle, where temperatures could remain below freezing for weeks. Water became a persistent problem. Wells might freeze, stored barrels of water turned to ice. Kitchens scrambled to manage supply. Firewood consumption skyrocketed, and rationing became essential. Even the most opulent households faced practical limits. Firewood piles could be exhausted faster than expected. Coal or peat might have to supplement logs. If supplies ran low, households implemented rotation systems. Only key rooms were heated, while secondary chambers were left cold. Now let's float inside. Even in the Lord's chamber, cold could creep in. Thick curtains, furs, and heated stones provided partial relief, but no fire can perfectly warm a stone building in extreme frost. Bedrooms might remain painfully chilly, especially near outer walls or higher ceilings. Servants' quarters, often in corridors, attics, or the Great Hall, were even harsher. Huddling together, layering blankets, and rotating near hearths became essential survival tactics. And prolonged cold affected routines. Cooking became more critical. Hot meals and drinks were not just sustenance, they were sources of warmth.
Thick soups, stews, and porridge were consumed continuously to maintain body heat. Some households even developed subtle behavioral adaptations, staying active indoors, pacing halls, and performing light chores to keep circulation going before bedtime. Let's talk about bedding again. Straw mattresses could become damp or frozen near unheated stone floors. Regular airing became vital, sometimes performed in the middle of winter when sunlight allowed, or by moving bedding closer to the hearth temporarily. Feather beds were a godsend, but rare and expensive. Layering blankets and furs became the main defense against freezing. Warming pans and heated stones were used more frequently, sometimes multiple times in one night. Now consider health implications. Extended exposure to cold increased susceptibility to illness. Frostbite was rare indoors, but not impossible, especially for those sleeping closest to walls or far from the hearth. Circulation problems, stiff joints, and poor sleep quality were common complaints. Even nobility felt these effects, though their layered bedding and heated implements mitigated risks. Servants bore the brunt of extreme winters, relying heavily on communal warmth and careful management of limited resources. Architecture also revealed its limits. Tall ceilings and massive stone walls, perfect for defense, were terrible for heat retention. Open hearths wasted much of their warmth up chimneys. Shutters and curtains helped, but prolonged cold often overwhelmed even the best prepared chambers. In response, households developed small, inventive solutions. Beds might be rearranged to catch subtle currents of warm air from the hearth. Blankets layered strategically. Heated stones moved closer to sleeping areas during the coldest hours. Shared sleeping arrangements became critical. Even animals were sometimes used tactically. Pets, or occasionally small livestock in nearby chambers, provided subtle extra warmth. Psychological strategies mattered more than ever. Awareness of the cold was constant, but people trained themselves to endure. Patience, quiet reflection, and acceptance of discomfort were part of life. Storytelling, prayer, and social interaction served as mental insulation against the persistent chill. Now let's drift over to the social hierarchy aspect again. Extreme winters emphasized the gap between the well-off and the less privileged. Nobles could afford multiple layers, heated implements, and fireplaces in several rooms. Servants relied on huddling, rotation, and careful positioning. Even within families, body heat management became a subtle strategy. Who slept closest to the fire, who shared blankets, who moved during the night to optimize warmth. It was a delicate choreography, often instinctive, sometimes documented in household records. And then there's the seasonal preparation we mentioned earlier, amplified in extreme winters. Households began stockpiling extra firewood, textiles, and heated implements. Beds were layered more heavily. Linen, wool, and fur were all used strategically. Kitchens increased production of hot meals and beverages. Every household chore became indirectly connected to warmth management. Let's imagine a night in an extreme winter. The fire glows faintly in the hearth, curtains drawn tight, thick blankets layered over a straw mattress, heated stones at the foot of the bed, nightcaps and woolen clothing tucked snugly around the body. Outside, the wind moans against battlements. Inside, life persists. Movement, layering, sharing body heat, tending embers, and quiet conversation, all tiny human strategies that allow the household to endure. And even in these harshest conditions, medieval peoples survived. Not comfortably by modern standards, not luxuriously, but tolerably, skillfully, and ingeniously. In the next part, we'll drift into seasonal routines, how households transitioned from autumn into deep winter, maintained warmth over months, and adapted to the relentless cycle of medieval winters, often invisible to modern eyes, but crucial for survival.
Seasonal routines and the long winter grind. All right, let's drift now into the rhythm of the medieval year, specifically how castles and their inhabitants prepared for, endured, and eventually emerged from long winters. Winter wasn't just a single cold night. It was a slow, grinding season that could stretch for months. October might bring the first frost. By December, days were short, nights long, and temperatures relentlessly low. February could feel endless, with snow drifting against walls and ice forming in wells. Preparation began in autumn. Households checked every piece of textile, curtains, blankets, tapestries, and rugs. Frayed edges were repaired. Heavy fabrics were prioritized for bedrooms, especially for the lord, lady, and close family. Firewood was stockpiled, dried, and layered in accessible locations. Some households had vaulted storage rooms to keep fuel dry. Others relied on careful rotation to prevent moisture accumulation. Water management became critical. Wells were monitored. Barrels were moved indoors or near the hearth to prevent freezing. In some castles, ingenious methods allowed water to be preheated slightly before use, though this was labor-intensive. Let's float inside to the human routines. Daily life shifted in winter. Meals were timed to coincide with warmth. Kitchens were central hubs of heat and activity. Hot stews, porridge, and bread were staples, providing both sustenance and body warmth. Attendants had chore schedules attuned to the cold. Fires were tended multiple times a day, embers stoked at intervals, and heated stones prepared for nighttime use. Night attendants monitored sleeping areas, ensuring embers didn't die completely and that warming implements were ready for bed. Sleep itself adapted to seasonal extremes. People often followed the segmented sleep pattern: first sleep, wakefulness, second sleep. This allowed the household to monitor fires, rotate bedding or warming implements, and make minor adjustments to manage discomfort. In extreme cold, this pattern became even more crucial. Temperatures in chambers could drop significantly overnight. Being able to wake, move, or adjust bedding without fully arising was a vital survival strategy. Now let's drift into bed and bedding routines. Straw mattresses were aired when possible, layered with blankets, furs, or feather beds for those who could afford them. Beds were positioned strategically away from cold exterior walls, toward fireplaces, or closer to interior walls that retained warmth. Blankets and furs were layered intentionally, sometimes even rolled or tucked to create insulating pockets. Heated stones or pans were placed near feet or under bedding for a few hours of gentle radiated warmth. Clothing for sleep was also carefully managed. Linen shifts, wool tunics, nightcaps, and socks were standard. Some households added extra layers during extreme cold. Gloves, scarves, or even wrapped bundles of cloth could supplement warmth. Let's float over to social aspects. Shared sleeping arrangements remained central. Nobility slept with close family or attendants. Servants huddled together in corridors or the Great Hall. Body heat was a resource, and its careful allocation was often instinctive. Pets and small animals sometimes contributed warmth, particularly in colder regions where indoor stabling was nearby. Dogs, cats, and occasionally smaller livestock added a subtle thermal advantage. Now, architecture's seasonal role becomes apparent. Curtains were drawn at dusk.
Shutters were closed on windows. Floors were layered with rushes or straw to mitigate cold. Furniture and beds were placed to catch interior warmth efficiently. Narrow passageways helped retain heat. Secondary rooms acted as buffers, preventing entire wings from freezing. Even minor adjustments mattered. Heating implements were rotated, beds repositioned, blankets rearranged, and fires tended with precision. Survival depended on this constant, almost unconscious choreography. Let's float back to the psychological rhythm. Winter nights were long, dark, and often monotonous. People coped through habit, shared storytelling, prayer, and quiet activity. These routines created mental insulation, helping to tolerate cold when physical warmth was limited. Extreme winters tested patience and endurance, but through careful planning, textiles, firewood, bedding, clothing, and behavioral adaptations, households managed to survive the months when the world outside was a frozen landscape. And then, slowly, subtly, spring approached. Daylight lengthened, temperatures eased, snow melted, ice in wells softened, fires burned less urgently, bedding could be aired more extensively. Human routines shifted once again. Nights became less segmented. Daily chores were less dominated by fire maintenance. The castle slowly moved from survival mode toward comfort mode. Even after months of endurance, the memory of winter's discipline persisted. Households retained practices and preparations for the next season, knowing that winter would return, relentless and inevitable. And as we continue, we'll drift into the final layers of this story, the enduring legacy of medieval sleep practices, how they shaped human behavior, architecture, and even modern perceptions of comfort in cold environments.
Legacy, lessons, and the medieval night. All right, let's drift slowly now toward the final stretch, where we consider the legacy of all these winter routines and cold nights and castles. Not just what people did to survive, but how those practices shaped their lives, their architecture, and even the way we think about comfort today. First, let's linger on sleep itself. Medieval sleep was strategic, segmented, layered, and socially orchestrated. It was never just lying down and closing your eyes. It involved planning, preparation, and awareness of your environment, something modern sleepers rarely consider. The segmented sleep pattern, first sleep, wakefulness, second sleep, was influenced heavily by environmental factors, long nights, cold temperatures, and the unpredictability of a hearth's warmth. It created a rhythm, almost a nocturnal choreography that guided household activity through the night. Humans adapted, not just physically, but psychologically. The cold trained patience. Extended darkness fostered quiet reflection. Communal warmth reinforced social bonds. Now, let's drift to architecture. Castles were defensive by design, but centuries of human adaptation slowly softened their edges. Interiors became more functional, with room placement, fireplaces, bed positioning, curtains, and tapestries, all reflecting an evolving understanding of heat management. Even seemingly minor innovations, like the Kakelofin stoves in Central Europe, or the clever placement of heated stones and warming pans, represent a long tradition of ingenuity aimed at surviving what nature threw at people. We can also look at textiles. Layering techniques, heavy wool curtains, furs, and strategically used bedding all influenced the domestic interiors of the time. These weren't mere luxuries, they were survival tools. And over centuries, the art of layering and insulation trickled down through society, influencing everything from furniture design to household management. Human ingenuity didn't stop at the obvious.
People developed habits, social strategies, and even small rituals to maintain warmth. Shared sleeping arrangements, night attendants to tend fires, strategic placement of beds and bedding, pets contributing heat, subtle exercises before sleep. Every action, no matter how small, mattered. And let's drift into the psychological legacy. The medieval approach to cold and darkness, accepting discomfort, layering strategies, communal coping, segmented sleep, offers lessons in resilience. People survived conditions that modern humans would find unbearable. They did so with patience, creativity, and social coordination. Even when winter was long, brutal, and relentless, life persisted. Stories were told, work continued, rituals maintained. Comfort, when available, was treasured, but never assumed. This endurance shaped social hierarchies as well. The distribution of warmth mirrored societal structures. Nobles had access to the best beds, heated implements, and interior chambers. Servants relied on collective strategies, rotation, and ingenuity to survive. Even small acts, like huddling together for heat, reflected both necessity and social dynamics. And finally, the human element. Adaptation over centuries transformed the way people related to space, sleep, and survival. Castles became more than fortresses. They became orchestrated environments where humans negotiated warmth, hierarchy, and comfort. Sleep was no longer simply a biological necessity. It became a carefully managed activity intertwined with fire management, architecture, textiles, social structure, and psychological endurance. The legacy is subtle. Modern perceptions of comfort, room heating, and even the design of bedrooms carry echoes of these medieval strategies. Heavy curtains, layered bedding, zoning of interior spaces, all are descendants of centuries of cold nights and slow adaptation. So as we end this long drift through frost, stone, and human ingenuity, consider this. Medieval castles were never truly warm, but through textiles, fire, social strategies, and human creativity, life continued, night after night, winter after winter. The cold shaped people as much as people shaped the castle. And in that quiet, enduring dance, we find a strangely elegant balance between survival, comfort, and the human spirit. And now, if you've been slowly drifting along with me, the lights are dim, the embers glow softly, and you might feel the medieval chill fading away. Sleep well.